I'm Keith Hilson with the Schmidt Music Trombone Shop, back with another instrument review for you. And today I've got a really interesting instrument on a number of fronts, specifically a heavily modified Conn 60H bass trombone. So 60H was the single rotor version of the classic 62H. And this particular horn, which is from around 1969, so really at the end of the classic Elkhart era, has gone through a lot of modifications, additions from the folks at BAC down in Kansas City. So it's a really interesting mix of some classic trombone designs along with some new technologies and additions all come together in a very unique package. So I'm excited to share this with you. I'm going to be playing everything on this bass trombone today on my Hammond 19BL mouthpiece. As I mentioned, the Conn 60H was the single rotor version of the classic 62H. Like the 62H of that era, again, we're talking about Elkhart era, and this particular horn was built in 1969. These instruments were designed, tuning in slide. This particular one, we're looking at a red brass bell. With it 9.5 inches. So, it really, at that time, that both the single rotor, dual rotor version were really staples in the bass trombone community. Now, while we still, of course, see folks who see some advantages in single rotor bass trombones, for a lot of the duties of the modern bass trombonist, we really need to have another valve added onto it here, which is why the owner of this instrument went through with the folks at BAC to do a lot of customization work to really take a classic instrument and move it into the 21st century here. So, like I mentioned, the classic 60H, we're looking at a 9.5-inch bell. In this case, they were using what they termed at that point red brass. It looks to me either a rose brass or maybe even a gold brass. They were calling it red brass at that time. Now, of course, one of the features right away is we're looking at the tuning and slide, which means that everything here, the neck pipe coming through our crook into the bell, everything, we're dealing with that red brass, and it's all completely conical because we have the tuning in slide. So again, just as a refresher for those folks who are not familiar with the tune in slide concept, it is the idea that trombones, even though it's a cylindrical instrument, in other words, the tubing size is staying more or less the same through the majority of the instrument, there is a theory that the more conical we can make the instrument, the better the response, or at least it responds differently. And honestly, of all of the makers out there, at least the American makers, Conn was really one of the earliest and kind of longest existing proponents of this. Now, of course, the trombone has some inherent issues with this concept, namely that we have to have so much of the length of the instrument parallel, cylindrical, right? You can't make the slide conical. But there are other ways we can change that experience. We can go through and we can use, for example, dual bore hand slides. And there's an argument that part of the reason that dual bore hand slides work the way they do is because you're getting some of that conical type of nature, changing the bore instrument smaller to larger, which is improving or at least changing the experience with the instrument. So you can look at dual bore hand slides, obviously changing some of the taper through the crook here. But then the argument is really if we can make the bell section as conical as possible, we can, again, give it more of the conical instrument nature, a warmer, broader sound, a little bit softer response. Some people feel like it slots a little bit easier. So how do we do that? Well, instead of having the tuning slide up here, where again, we have to have some cylindrical, some parallel legs for the tuning slide, we put the tuning mechanism down here in the hand slide instead, where everything has to be parallel anyway. Now, there are, as we can hear, there's potentially some advantages to that. There are drawbacks. The biggest drawback with the tuning and slide mechanism is that it makes the hand slide potentially quite a bit heavier, because not only do you have the additional mechanism of the tuning and slide setup, so typically you have some type of locking nut system, and there's any number of different ones out there, but of course you have to have extra length here. We have to be building in extra tubing for the actual tuning slide mechanism in here. So with the owner of this instrument, one of the things that they did with this instrument was work with BAC to build a kind of partial carbon fiber slide setup. And BAC has done some really interesting things experimenting with this, either full carbon fiber hand slides, or in this case, kind of a partial carbon fiber hand slide, really again with the idea of dropping down the weight of that tuning and slide mechanism. And I think it does help. Now, the other big change that they made with this instrument was the valve setup. So, of course, at that time, the original 60H, we would have been looking at one of their single rotor setups. And at that time, as we know, the rotors were not quite as advanced, or at least they weren't bringing the same ideas to the table as we see with all of our different rotor options out there now. They tend to be, even if they were building them oversized for bass trombone, they were still a little bit more resistant. So in this case, we've added on not one, but two of the classic Rotax valves, which a lot of folks find to be a lot more responsive, very, very even playing all the way through. And in this case, we have it set as a dependent setup. So we're looking at an FD setup here. And there are some advantages to that. Obviously, in this case, it made a lot of sense because if we were doing an independent setup, well, we're going to ruin a lot of the conical nature of the tuning and slide. So it makes a lot of sense to do the dependent setup in this case here. And as we know, there are some airflow advantages that having the dependent setup can give us as well. Depending on the player, it can be advantages or they can be potentially drawbacks with it. And then, of course, we have all of the other really great BAC features here. They're doing their classic pigtail kind of setup that we've seen from BAC. Of course, Williams did stuff with this back in the day. And we've got the classic, in the loop, bell brace right here. All of those features, obviously a wonderful job with the finish. BAC always does a fantastic job with all the finishing. So we have this really wonderful brushed matte finish on it. It's a very visually stunning instrument, but of course, how does it play? It plays great. It's a different experience. In general, I always have to work to kind of figure out the tuning and slide setup, whether we're talking bass, tenor, alto, whatever it is kind of a different air approach with it. The best way I kind of describe it, it's a little bit like when I think of like classic, German Teutonic instruments, where they tend to take a much slower, broader airflow. It's a little bit like going to play euphonium. One of the big complaints of trombone players moving to euphonium is that they make the euphonium sound too much like a trombone because they're coming with this more focused airstream that we need to have for trombone. Well, with euphonium tuba or other cylindrical instruments, they really do need a much kind of slower, broader air concept. And I think in a lot of ways, I find that similarly with the tuning and slide mechanisms. And I would argue that's really kind of part of the concept behind that. So what do you get with that change in air concept? Well, I just love right off the bat just the overall plushness of this instrument. I think it's exceptionally fluid. I think it's got this beautiful, this wonderful warmth and this connection to it. And I feel like there's some colors that you can really play around with. The overall timbre, it's always, to me, even when I really lay into it, it's always got this little bit of softness around the outside of the sound, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think for a lot of bass trombonists, they're always trying to find that balance where you want to get some of that bite and some of that clarity and almost a little bit of an edge to the sound, depending on what you're trying to do. But obviously, we don't want that to go overboard. And so I think a setup like this, part of it can be the overall blow of the instrument. The bell material, obviously, we know that the more copper-heavy materials tend to have a little bit more color. They tend to be a little bit softer, broader in general. I think that combined with the airflow, the tuning and slide is really playing hand in hand with all of that. I think, and then going on to the valve, there is definitely some compression, especially when we go onto both valves. And that is, for some folks, when they talk about the dependent setups, why they like them or maybe why they don't like them, that is one of the conversation points where when you go onto the second valve on a dependent setup, you're changing the resistance more. We're really going from a more open setup off of the single valve. Right, and that's part of the whole idea with the independent versus dependent. Independent, you get the second valve out of the way until you need to have it, right? Versus the independent, where we always have the airflow going through both valves. Now, the argument with the independent setup can be, in part, obviously there's some differences as far as the overall technique and everything that brings to the table, but on the other hand as well, there is a little bit more evenness. The airflow tends to be more similar throughout the entire blow of the valve section versus the dependent setup, where we're going from quite open on the open horn to adding a little bit more resistance with the single rotor. When we're using it, obviously then we're adding even more resistance on the second rotor as well. So it is a change in some of the airflow. I did like some of the response, again, when I was going down to that low C, low B range. If I touched it, if I attacked it the right way, it had this immediacy to it. I felt very comfortable slurring in and out of it. And I felt like it was again, everything slotted really well. As far as like immediacy, articulation, it was a little bit different. And I think part of that, it could be the wrap, it could be the valves, any number of different things there. I just found, as myself as a player, I just had to attack those notes, especially on the double trigger register. I had to attack them just a little bit differently to get the kind of response. It's a little bit different than what I'm used to, not in a bad way, just in a different way. But like I said, the overall idea, and by the way, I was going to mention with the tuning slide, this really does help with the weight. So many of the tuning slide mechanisms we play, even when we have makers who are being very conscientious about the weight and the setup and everything, there is a heft to it that not everybody likes. With this, it feels, there is a little bit of heft, but it feels much more natural in a lot of ways. It certainly doesn't grab my attention as being a lot heavier than a lot of other bass trombone hand slides I've played. I didn't feel like, from a technical standpoint, that it was really getting in the way at all. Like I said, and of course, the build quality and everything with it, we're taking instruments at that time, again, the Elkhart area, the instruments that were really, really well built, renowned for how they played, how they were made, and then we're putting it in the hands of some of the best instrument customizers on the planet with BAC. And I think, again, the very, very unique instrument. I really like that idea, taking a classic design, modernizing it, but at the same time keeping it very much kind of in the spirit of the original design. So very well done on all fronts there. I'm really glad that we have it in the shop and are able to experience it. So if you have any thoughts or questions about this 60H, the classic 62H's, BAC instruments, or anything else, please feel free to leave them in the comments. We'd love to have you as a part of the conversation. If you liked this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. Please think about subscribing to our channel if you haven't already done so you can be a part of our community, see when we have more of these videos coming out, and of course, you can find the Trombone Shop on Facebook and Instagram. As always, thanks for watching.